Hey, Super Dave here. Thank you for joining me for another edition of Bleeding Edge Interviews, where we dig a little deeper into the minds of the people making all that awesome progressive rock and metal that's out there these days. If, like me, you have been paying attention to the progosphere over the last several years, there are a few notable absences in terms of releasing new music during that time. In particular, Opeth, Pain of Salvation. Well, one of those bands that has been absent during that time, Caligula's Horse, is about to correct that with a new album dropping January 26th entitled Charcoal Grace. I had the lucky opportunity to sit down and chat with Sam Vallen, co-founder, guitarist, one of the primary songwriters for the band, about the new album, about the upcoming tour with that, and about all the things that make Caligula's Horse the band that they are. So without further ado, here is my interview with Sam Vallen of Caligula's Horse. Good day, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. David, right? Good to meet you, mate.
Nice meeting you as well. Pretty early there where you're at, I imagine, yes?
Yeah, it's 10 a.m. right now, which is kind of perfect for these kind of things before my brain goes into decline in the mid-afternoon. So it's great.
I know that feeling. Actually, a little later than I thought it was going to be. I haven't quite figured out the time difference between US and Australia. So you're actually
all I know is that when we try and go on tour, it's almost impossible to call our families from like the Americas. So yes, it sucks.
That's more than a bit rough. Well, thank you for joining me this morning where you're at, this evening where I'm at. It's very cool to talk to you, sir.
Yeah, you too, man.
So, all right. So I'm very excited to be able to talk about new Caligula's Horse music and such, talking from my perspective, and a little bit of background is about when I started this Bleeding Edge gig it was 3 years ago this past July. So pandemic in full force at that point in time. And at that point, I also was discovering, even as much as I thought I knew the world of progressive rock and metal and all that, I had so much to learn. I still do. And there are some bands that kind of up to this moment almost, it was like they were frozen in amber, because everything I could know about them at that time is everything I can still know about them up to this moment now. Opeth being a very notable one. They've not had an album since 2019, Pain of Salvation, and of course, Caligula's Horse. And so I'm very excited that there's something new coming out and we get to hear new stuff, or I'm already getting to hear some new stuff ahead of the crowd. But it's a great thing. And meanwhile, I kind of look back and I think, wow, I wonder what the path has been for you guys during all of that time. And I know it began pretty much right off the bat with the cancellation of your first US headlining tour before it even got started. So I'm kind of curious the road that you all have traveled during that time and what you've been dealing with while you've been working on this new album.
Yeah, it's a tough one because, as you rightly point out, we did actually release our previous album right into the pandemic. It sounds like you did exactly the same thing with the launch of your podcast. But the thing is, we really didn't anticipate what would happen when we did that. When we were finishing tracking and stuff for Rise Radiant in 2019, sort of had probably the best laid plans we've ever had in our career. As you say, we had the US tour, we had basically a bunch of other stuff that sort of followed the following 18 months after album release. We had it all mapped out and planned, and it was ready to just work. Like it's probably as organized as we've ever been in terms of getting everything out of an album release. And on top of that, on a slightly more personal note, we really loved that record. Like it felt like a perfect reflection of who we were at that particular point in time, coming off the bat of all of the touring we'd done previously and kind of building our career, slowly brick by brick up until that point. Yeah. But then we released it into the pandemic, and basically everything at that point, maybe even, a couple of months before the album's release, everything was just pushed back indefinitely. So we as a band started, even before the Rise Radiant release, started living with this idea of, okay, so who are we now? We're not a band who can go on tour anymore. We're not a band who can kind of do the regular release schedule we would normally do. Who are we? What do we do as musicians in this kind of milieu? And the truth is that we really struggled with it. Like some bands just went to being purely digital and doing tons of live streams and things like that. speaking personally, my day job became way harder as I tried to sort of make it work online. We all kind of struggled with these things, and we all also lived with this kind of resentment. I know a lot of bands had this, of not being able to experience the sort of plans we had for our previous album. You got to think, like, if you're not able to do anything on the back of a record, obviously the clamor immediately becomes, what are you going to do next? And we're just sitting here thinking, well, we haven't done this yet, though.
Yeah.
So we had this kind of internal battle, like each of us as individuals and us as a band, as to whether we were happy to leave Rise Radiant behind and start working on a new record. And that took quite a while for us to finally answer yes to. I've sort of described this to some people as like it was almost a kind of writer's block in a way, but writer's block tends to be a bit more abstract. I can't find a way to write. This was much more like we had all these extrinsic forces kind of pushing against us, just making it difficult to sit down and take seriously the endeavor of what's our next step. Because as I said, the previous step, as far as we were concerned, really hadn't been fully experienced yet. So that was the sort of background of writing Charcoal Grace on the back of Rise Radiant. The other element of it is that we also saw a lot of things through the pandemic, like all of us, like us as a global community, which were quite hard to get past as well. Like in Australia, we obviously went into some of the most immediate and harshest lockdowns in the world, which was good. It kept us very immune from the experiences of the pandemic, as opposed to places like Italy and stuff where it was quite extreme quite early. But what ended up sort of happening is we had, much like I'm sure you did here, we had like toilet paper hoarders. We had people just doing things in our quote unquote community, which just sort of threw a bit of a damper on our experience of the world. Like it was hard to sort of look at people the same way after the pandemic. And so this album was necessarily us pushing against that as well. On the one hand, we've got our career ending. On the other hand, we've got this kind of very surprisingly jaded view of the world around us, being a band that for so many years have sort of prized the idea of kind of positivity as a fundamental quality of what we write music about. So we decided that it needed to be two things. It needed to, on the one hand, be an album that reflects the time honestly, and on the other hand, it needs to be a kind of catharsis for us, like a chance to put everything together that we've experienced and we've felt both as individuals and as a collective, and get it out so that we can move on. So we've joked about the album being kind of as a theme, the things we learned during the pandemic years, and hopefully it's a catharsis. We put it out into the world and it embodies that time, so we don't have to live it anymore. And hopefully it kind of does that for other people too. That was the idea,
Yeah. Well, it's as usual, you guys have a very well thought out thematic run through as far as what you're putting on the albums and everything. So I'm not surprised to hear that that's all there. And as you were talking, I'm left wondering, I'm like, when we get to see some of that less savory side of humanity when under stress, as a lot of us did. And the toilet paper hoarding, frankly, I'll take the silver lining to that is I now swear by bidets, so I'm cool there.
Yeah.
But I got to wonder what a challenge, I guess, it is in that sense when you're being given more and more reasons to be jaded and a bit cynical about humanity, to continue to put forth that effort to be positive in your outlook and your output at the same time. How hard was that to do for you guys in the midst of all of that?
Yeah, I kind of hinted before at the fact that, like, in the past, our back catalogue really has had that shared quality of, at its foundation, being quite positive. We obviously explore a lot of dark concepts, but we've always had the policy that we don't dwell on the dark at the expense of the light. There should always be some kind of balance. For what it's worth, I mean, it's a whole digression, I guess you could go on there, but it's the way I feel also about composing music. You can't have heavy without light, or you can't have sort of dark and atonal without tonal. The more that balance is stretched in one direction, the less dramatic I find stuff sounds and the less kind of emotive. So that's also very much true here. But as you rightly say, it was a particularly unique experience to try and have that positivity in light of the sort of circumstances that we found ourselves in. So we sort of we suspended that rule a little bit. You know, there's a lot on Charcoal Grace which is a lot more actually, I'll say a lot less preoccupied with the idea of having a positive spin. There are certain things that just state a kind of a dark truth or a sort of lesson learned, and just leave it at that. And it's the first time we ever did that deliberately. You know, we sort of said, look, if we're going to try and have a positive spin on a time which, frankly, in a lot of ways just isn't positive, there's a lot of stuff that we've learned that can really not be unlearned at the end of that period. In saying that, most of the album still does have a positive spin because, you know, we are hopeful people at the end of the day, but we realize that that really would have to be the contrasting element of this record against the backdrop of the rest of our catalog, just because otherwise it would feel disingenuous. You know, it would feel like we're kind of making a statement that is simply untrue.
Right.
Yeah, but again, hopefully this acts as a catharsis for this time, and hopefully after this time, we no longer have to be thinking like that. You know, maybe we can go back to a more positive outlook. We'll see.
That would be very welcome. But I like what you say in the terms of contrast. I've always honestly been someone who enjoys the contrast. I like dark coffee, and then I throw in vanilla creamer, and, you know, or
Yeah.
I don't like to wear dark pants with a dark shirt or vice versa. I've always somehow or other drifted towards that. And I honestly think that's probably one of the things I find most attractive about progressive oriented rock and metal is the fact that you can have those contrasts oftentimes multiply in the middle of one song. So I think that's the one thing that takes me. But I like that idea as well, that the outlook, having the contrasting outlooks of you can look at the darkness, but don't forget about the light as well. You know, it's a nice message. And it makes me curious as well. So talking more about Charcoal Grace, first thing that comes to mind, and oddly enough, the one thing I did not get to finding out before this, mostly because it slipped my mind, was the phrase Charcoal Grace, the term. What does that represent? Where does that come from?
We've sort of described it as well, lyrically, it's used as a kind of metaphorical, I guess, sort of like a top-down, broad brush metaphorical term for silence. Like this idea of silence being kind of beautiful and alluring and grim and strange, and really just trying to sort of find a poetic way of describing, you know, that incredibly complicated and wide-ranging symbol, the idea of silence, which is probably the most pervasive theme on the album, explored in a lot of different ways lyrically, you know, across a lot of different songs. So that's really what it is. It's a manifestation of silence lyrically, but it was also just a phrase that felt in a poetic sense to really capture a lot of the mood of the album, the theme. So the short answer is it doesn't specifically mean anything, but it is used to refer to silence, used to kind of give it some characteristics to make it feel a little bit more, I guess, like anthropomorphized, I suppose you could say. But you know, it's also one of those phrases at the moment you hear it, it sort of brings a lot of things to mind, I would hope. And that's usually what we try and do with album titles anyway.
Yeah, it does. It was a very intriguing title, I think, in my mind. Now, my daughter was very artistically inclined, went to art classes and all that, mostly so she could become a tattoo artist, which was the original goal. And then she moved away from that. But nonetheless, charcoal, the first thing came to my mind was, you know, the artistic use of charcoal, believe it or not. I imagine there's probably a lot of other folks out there that might poke me in the side and go, Dave, grilling? Barbecue? No, sorry, no. I'm thinking I had an artistic daughter. That's the first thing came to mind, but it gave me that idea of the darker palette along with the concept of grace, which, as you said, is fits in my mind a concept of light again, which that's part of the reason it came to my mind to ask as well. As you were talking about that, I thought, oh, is that what the title means? No.
No, well, the thing is, like, because obviously the idea of like the medium of charcoal, the artistic medium, was something that we discussed as well. I think my simplest takeaway, like outside of the lyrical use in the song Vigil, is the idea that charcoal is kind of the wake of something. You know, it's the end of a fire. It's the end of a blaze, right? And it's like the beauty in the end of something, which again is sort of how it's tied, I suppose, to the image of silence. But I mean, to be perfectly honest, because the thing is, I'm a very analytical person, like both in a
Yeah.
kind of literary and musical sense. And sometimes I also like to try and remove myself from these readings because, again, I will continue to do them. It's just what I'm inclined to do. But there's something beautiful about just letting a phrase wash over you as well, you know. And
Yeah.
that's what appealed to me about that one when Jim pitched it.
Yeah. Very cool. So I know that Rise Radiant was very, very critically acclaimed. I think you're going to see
Mm,
similar success with this one as well because I think it builds on that. But I know that you were also in the bit of changing up the way in which you composed, and
mm,
that you were inviting everybody in the band to contribute more.
mm.
And I'm curious if that's something that has continued, or is it something, or did things shift around a little bit in the intervening
Mm.
almost 4 years we're going close to at this point?
We kind of had to go back to the drawing board in some ways.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go a little bit. I'm gonna preamble just a moment before I answer the question directly. I do promise I'll get to it. But we did have to change a few things up. Like I said, we started the creation of this album in a very bad place creatively.
Yeah.
Like we really struggled to just begin the next step of writing, and so we kind of had this formative step, which we don't normally have, where we basically just collected a bunch of musical ideas entirely abstracted from songs. Now, when I say we don't normally do that, I guess it's worth giving that a little bit of context. Like the normal approach that we take to writing is I'll usually come up with a small portion of music, usually kind of fleshed out with some element of an arrangement. So we've got a
Mhm.
feel and a direction. And then Jim and I will workshop melodies and then eventually lyrics over that section so that then that section can inspire sort of what surrounds it, either before or after in the song, which is a little bit different than a lot of bands. A lot of bands, especially in metal, tend to sort of do you often see that bottom up kind of approach, like, write the music, add the lyrics. I
Right.
much prefer the idea that things influence one another in composition. I get really excited when Jim's got like the line Charcoal Grace, like a line that can then sort of inspire me to play around with some other musical ideas, turn some dials, and hopefully create something that has this holistic connection between those two
Yeah.
elements. So with that preamble out of the way, we had to just collect a bunch of ideas because we didn't know stylistically where we were going to go with this. We
Mhm.
really had no clue whatsoever. So we did that for probably a few months until things started coming together and started to present a course for the record, which we identified reasonably early on as being a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more protracted, and not afraid of getting far darker than we have in the past, as I kind of hinted at before. Once we had that direction, the approach was actually not that dissimilar from Rise Radiant. So I did a lot of writing sessions with, I'd get Josh over into my little studio or Dale over. We'd just kind of sit down and just throw some ideas around and show them what I'm working on, get some thoughts. And as a result, we have, I can't remember the exact breakdown, but a lot of co-writes on the record. In fact, The World Breathes with Me, I believe, I might be wrong about this. I think it's actually the first song that has all band members have a writer's credit, simultaneously.
Nice.
So, while it was still an album that was principally kind of Jim and my, like collaboration, um, the guys are increasingly having more of a hand on that. And I love it because, when it comes to album writing time, I just disappear for hundreds of hours until sort of things
Yeah.
form themselves. So having some people to bounce stuff off and having some ideas injected into that pool is just fantastic. And I think we were all really on the same page once we got past that formative period. So it wasn't like there was any, how do I put it lightly? You can have a lot of collaborative ventures where things just feel like they're a hodgepodge of different
Mhm.
ideas that don't really have any kind of common thread. That
Yeah.
was not the case here. We all knew what we were going for, and as a result, it was easy to find
Yeah.
ideas that work together and so forth.
That's nice. It's not so easy to find that kind of cohesive synergy with
Mm,
a group of people, especially with two that have had a long-standing writing partnership, and then
mm,
you bring some new people in. So it strikes me as a very, I think, lucky thing to
mm.
to hear that more people come into the mix, and it just seemed to just be adding a few more flavors to the stew, and it
Yeah,
worked out
I
really
think
nicely.
Lucky is the word, because like I'm very fortunate that our band is an incredibly tight unit now. Like not just tight as a band. I mean, like tight as a group of friends and
Right.
sort of collaborators. But the thing is, like I've known Dale, for example, since before the band was formed. We went to uni together, like college. I don't know if you guys use the
Yeah.
word uni in the US. Yeah,
I can't
we went
say for everybody, but I do.
yes, we went to college together, and we've written songs together over the years and stuff. And of course, Josh has been a member of the band since the In Contact years, the early writing of that. So it's not like they add themselves to the writing and then suddenly I'm being pulled in different directions. They kind of appreciate the process we take, and both of them are really good at just integrating themselves kind of into that. So I get the most of their creative input and they get the most of providing that creative input. It never feels like there's any kind of unnecessary tension as a result. So it's very fulfilling. I mean, much like all of our artistic endeavors, it took a while on this album to get there, but once we got there, it was as easy as any other album. Like once it started feeling like we were creating something that was meaningful and beautiful to us, it starts to flow.
Nice. Yeah, I think probably the problems that occur when there are creative collaborations is that some people can maybe get a little defensive of their own ideas and a little protective of their space, and that makes the collaboration more difficult and eventually contentious. And at least
Absolutely.
the impression I get from you at this point in time, you're going, hey, it's more stuff to mix in, it's more feedback, great, give it to me, and
Yeah,
that
totally.
creates such a healthier environment, I think.
It does. It's I think it comes from the confidence that we have in the approach that we take. Like for a lot of people, because I teach at uni college. I teach at the conservatorium here, and we coach a lot of teenage songwriters, many of whom come in as people who've really never engaged in collaboration before. I get to see that kind of every day of my experience. And the thing is, I think back to when I started this band, especially around the kind of Tide Thief and River's End era, when Jim and I were really working out our writing partnership. And I remember we would be at each other's throat constantly, like we'd almost get to fists over ideas sometimes. But over the years, like Jim and I particularly have developed a trust in our collaboration. If someone really doesn't like an idea, cool, you're not just going to say that. That's something that's going to come up because it's important. And what's awesome is that, like, being that confident in our approach and that comfortable in our approach, it means that when other people come in to add things to it, or to offer their criticisms or their directions or their ideas for the way a song could go, it never really feels like it comes with the kind of I guess, for lack of better words, I'm sort of simplifying here, but the kind of ego that makes collaboration, quite tense at some times. I think we all just trust each other. I think trust is really the key to something like that working, so that we don't feel like there's any ulterior motives. I want to get my idea through or something like that. It's a lot more relaxed than that. But the point I was getting at is it wasn't always that way.
Right.
We had to get there.
It took some building, and maybe that's exactly what happened, is between you and Jim working on your end of that collaboration, is that by the time you really got good at it, adding people to the mix became a lot easier.
Yeah, it just felt natural.
Yeah. Nice. So I'm hearing a lot of the challenges you've encountered on the way to completing Charcoal Grace. I'm also curious, with challenges, there often come opportunities. So I'm wondering what kind of things maybe came up that expected and unexpected that were different this time around for you.
I think the entire premise behind the record was something that forced us outside of our comfort zone. I mean, it's worth saying that one of the fundamental ideas of Caligula's Horse, like as a kind of entity that begins writing albums every few years, is that we try and contrast what we've done in the past. Like that's a kind of rule. Each album has some reflection of its previous incarnation, but usually it's done very deliberately in a way that sort of puts us in a strange place as artists. I'm a big believer, I guess, slight side note, although it provides context to this, I'm a big believer in the idea that if you don't set limitations in creating an artistic product, it can tend to be quite pedestrian. Like, I really like putting stuff up that will challenge me, so that when I start building, the musical ideas, the artistic ideas that sort of create the album, I have to dig a little bit deeper. I can't just do the thing I did in the previous album and get away with it. So the challenge of the pandemic years, both that kind of extrinsic challenge I was describing and just the internal challenge of us as a band trying to work out what we're doing, that was considerable. That was something that took a bit to get over. But when we did get over it, it sort of automatically set a course for some of the creative elements, which was challenging enough that I was, I had to fight against it, and thus felt very artistically inspired to do so. So one of those things being the idea that if we are exploring these darker, and in a lot of ways, like more sophisticated kind of themes, like trying to blend our internal struggle with an external struggle as a kind of overarching concept of the record, we would need to be more thoughtful and spacious in our approach to music, and would need to be able to move between different moods, which themselves probably have a characteristic that's a lot more kind of, what's the word I'm looking for here, like polarized than they may have been in the past. Like, it's very hard to go from something kind of soft and light and gentle to something almost atonal and discordant without it feeling like a zigzag of ideas. And that's one of my pet peeves in progressive metal. I love the drama and the fact that you can create contrasts, but I really can't stand things that feel like it's just kind of stuck together ideas. Not accusing anyone of that, but it can be a bit of a trope sometimes in prog. So I guess the point I'm getting at here is the foundation of the album, the themes, made us have to get better at those things anyway. Otherwise we just wouldn't be able to communicate what we were trying to communicate. So, hard time to write an album, hard album to write, but I'm pretty stoked with how far it's sort of pushed us in a lot of those directions.
And when you're talking conceptual albums of this type, does it add extra layers of challenge in terms of track listing, in terms of deciding the order? I mean, obviously, if you've got something like The Wall that's telling a story, it's helpful to have it be in at least something resembling,
chronology.
The word I'm looking for, chronological order there. Otherwise, it can get confusing. And Lord knows that album in itself can be confusing in and of itself, especially to a fifth grader who was hearing it for the first time. Who am I talking about? Oh, I don't know. Could be me. And so I'm curious, how much does that add to the challenge? Or is it a matter of more the soundscapes that you're creating that lend towards putting the songs in the order they're in? Because I can't help but note, and I'm curious the intent behind it, and whether it'll be revealed to me when I can see the lyrics or catch up with them, is two very long songs bookend this album. And part of me says there's a half decent chance that's intentional, but I could be overreading into it.
No, very, very much so. I mean, for what it's worth, sequencing tends to be kind of a challenge anyway, with music like ours, where we do have things in drastically different keys and tempos and feels. And I like the idea that an album can be listened to from start to finish. I mean, this is a long record that might be demanding a little bit much of the audience, but that's certainly what we sequence for, with the idea that this is an experience that you have from start to finish. But to get into some of the more specifics, The World Breathes With Me, the opener, and then Mute, the closer, are kind of paired songs. Like they share a lot of musical motifs and a lot of themes, even if they're not exactly, they're certainly not like a part one and part two. They are just alike, they're kin. For what it's worth, they were actually conceived very differently throughout the writing. So there was a period where I was going to have The World Breathes With Me as track 2, and Mute was going to just be like a short intro, starting with that vocal kind of a cappella section, which then built into the song. But as I started playing with those ideas, I realized that there was just enough thematic material. There was actually, let me rephrase that. There was too much thematic material to just throw into like an intro and then a 10-minute tune. And I thought it was meaningful enough, like, kind of just as parts of a piece of music, meaningful enough to see how far I could sort of work through them, like how much I could get out of them, how dramatic I could make them. So after I started workshopping that, we realized that Mute really had a character all its own that was sort of worth, digging into. But they never stopped being related in terms of the motivic parts, or the musical parts that they share. So we decided if they weren't going to be seamlessly connected, because we wanted to have the suite in the middle, which I suppose is another conversation. It would make sense for them to be on either extreme of the album. So the end of Mute actually fades directly back into the start of Breathe, and you can kind of create this kind of cyclic listening environment. But it's also, I mean, maybe it's less obvious to some listeners. In fact, maybe some listeners never even think about this, but I actually love the idea of playing on familiarity. Like, if you listen to the album for the first time, you might get a sense listening to Mute that there are certain things that you can't quite place them, but they're similar. They feel familiar. And of course, it's because we seeded them 50 minutes ago in terms of the ideas that hit your ear back then and that your subconscious took on. I love playing with that kind of thing, even if it might feel like a very small, insignificant quality to some. I get really excited about it. The rest of the sequencing, once we decided that the suite was going to be in the middle, was actually kind of logical, because we needed to break up some of the loftiness. Unfortunately, we had two kind of single-esque songs in the Storm Chaser and Golem, which created a bit of space. Like, it wasn't quite as demanding on the listener, if that makes sense. So, we knew it made sense to kind of bookend the bigger songs with those. Bookend isn't really the right word. Let's say, it's kind of occupy the middle ground between those longer pieces of music. And of course, Sails and the Storm Chaser also share musical material. So we wanted them to be able to kind of seamlessly connect. As I'm saying this, I feel like there's actually a way simpler answer to this question, which is we couldn't really do much with the sequencing. We kind of had to do what we had to do, because there was so much material that was, shared between pieces of music that we wanted to be appreciated in that way. As for the suite, that one was actually a little bit more obvious, I think, because the prog trope is that you want to have the last song as the big long exploratory song that is listened to in one go, the kind of side length song trope. And we deliberately just wanted to break away from that. We did that in 2017 with In Contact, with the song Graves. And this is so different to that fundamentally in almost every compositional sense, that we wanted it to feel different also in the way you consume it, like the way you listen to it. So the middle of the album made perfect sense. The only problem we ran into was, how do you sequence a vinyl and make that make sense, which forced me to make sure the song didn't go over 24 minutes, or the suite rather didn't go over 24 minutes. And I'm not kidding. Like, there was actually a point writing that song where we had to sit down and go, like, shit, if we don't stop this thing, if I don't work out a way to wrap this up, we're not going to be able to release an LP, or we're going to have to split up the suite over sides, which would be horrible. So that was kind of a foregone conclusion as well, in the place that it would be on the album as a result. So hopefully that gives you some insight. I realized how chaotic that answer became as I started digging into it and realizing how complicated the decision was, but it seemed quite intuitive as we were doing it,
No, I honestly wouldn't call it chaotic at all. It's especially when you talk about something that part of my brain says, wait, I thought we didn't have to care about how long a side was anymore. Oh, wait, yes, we do, because people are collecting vinyl.
That was the one totally non-artistic choice we had to fight against. Yeah.
Literally, till you said that just now, it had not even occurred to me to think in those terms in this day and age. So the fact that there are so many different considerations there, certainly one gives me some insight into the potential challenges of putting an album together and deciding what goes where when it doesn't flow in a chronological order. But it also, again, for me, talking to you now, it just puts on display once again the thoughtfulness, the depth of thoughtfulness then upon which you approach all of your work, and that these things are going on in your head. And now I'm going to be looking for those repeating motifs within the music, because I live for that stuff right there. Like
me too.
Like
I mean,
I'm such a musician wannabe. I really am. So the concepts and the ideas behind putting it all together, it just fascinates me. So, and if I hadn't been such a lazy ass as a kid, I probably would have been a musician. But
no doubt.
instead, I'm just going to sit there and adore them.
Yeah. Well, there is one other element that's probably worth just adding as a slight addendum to that answer, which is that although this is a conceptual album, like it has a bunch of very distinct sort of concept themes at its foundation, we don't have that problem that The Wall has, or the problem that we had when we did The Tide, the Thief, and River's End in 2013,
Mhm.
where it is a narrative and thus has to have that chronology to it. Like this is a bunch of discrete ideas that all share a common theme, or all revolve around, I guess, a common experience. That's the way we've been kind of summing it up. So that makes it much easier. Like, in the past, when we've sequenced something like The Tide, the Thief, and River's End, we really did have to pay attention to how the story unfolds, and that's a kind of different challenge. So we got to avoid that challenge this time, but that's not to say that it made it that much easier, as I said.
All kinds of different challenges. And what I was saying, you mentioned Storm Chaser. I know made a particular note of that one. There's
Mm,
a midsection in there where there's a vocal mixing, and
mm, mm.
I don't know if it's overdubs because the voices sound similar enough to me in the first listen that,
Yeah.
or it's backing vocals, but it's really kind of cool because it's like,
Oh
here,
man,
there, and then moving around.
that was one of the funnest. That was actually one of the funnest sections to produce, and I remember it was one that we really struggled with. Like Storm Chaser was perhaps the last song we wrote for the record. Actually, it might have been some of Charcoal Grace, but it was one of the later creative parts. And I remember we were really struggling with this idea of like, how do you kind of build a bridge that gets away from a repeat of a chorus, so we don't just feel like we're kind of doing this verse chorus alternation, which we generally try and avoid. At least the idea of it feeling like a copy pasted section, which is quite common in sort of pop music, but
Yeah.
in music like ours, we want a little bit more. Anyway, I digress again because I can't help myself. But that section, yeah. So the idea was that we've got all of these overlapping vocals, but then in a production sense, I also did like a bunch of kind of vocodery things and some really digitally manipulated vocals, like all of this cool stuff that kind of makes it feel a little bit otherworldly, which hopefully was the experience you had. The album as a whole, and sorry, I know I'm going a little bit beyond the original comment, but like the album
No
as a
worries.
whole is really one where we explored the space of the vocals probably a lot more than we have in the past. Like there are certain parts where the vocals are quite quiet, or they're amongst the other instruments, much like that section you point out there, where you listen in headphones and you get this lush interaction of all of the instruments, where when you focus on something, you're hopefully immersed in everything around it as well. But that was really one where I just the artistic license of we've gone from having a really lead vocally verse, and we've got a really lead vocally chorus coming up. Let's just see what we can do with the voice to make it feel strange and exciting and somewhat alien. So I'm really glad you point out that section, because it's one that we had a lot of fun with, and I really like how it came out.
Yeah, it stands out. It absolutely was one of those moments that caught my attention. I long for the days, and I've made a commitment to myself that I'm doing this year a little bit differently, and I'll explain in a moment. But I long for
Mm,
the days when I was, a teenager, and I could afford maybe an album or two a month, and I'd get
mm.
one, and first thing I'm doing is I'm home, looking at the lyric sheet,
Oh man, I
reading
used to
along
do
with
it
the
too.
songs as I learned them, reading all the liner notes and things like that. Like I read every single word that was on those things.
Yeah.
And I got to, then I'm driving in the car to school or wherever and listening to the music. And I would really get to the point where, a song came up that I've heard maybe four times in the last 30 years. And
Mm,
yet, note for note, can sing along to it, word for
mm.
word, maybe a couple trip ups here and there because I maybe don't remember
Just
which section came next in
internalized.
that moment, but I correct immediately. And I'm going, I don't know what part of my brain is capable of doing that while the other part of my
Yeah.
brain, doesn't remember what I had for lunch today. But I wanna see if I can replicate that a little bit this year because I've got so much coming at me anymore. Like, I'll hear all this stuff, "Oh, that's great, that's great." I'm playing along with, and I'm almost always doing something else while I'm
Mm,
listening to it. So that's
mm,
one of the reasons where it comes to mind to say this is that's part of Storm Chaser stood out for me in the
mm.
midst of my brain doing 2 activities at once, as it
The
often does.
things.
So I've made this commitment to myself that I'm gonna try about once I'll pick 1 album each month that I'm just going to try and see how much I can immerse myself into it,
Mm.
listening to it without other things going on and read and I've decided that I'm gonna start that with Charcoal Grace.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
and just, see if at some point in time this brain still has the capability of remembering music to the depth that I used to, because I love that
Yeah.
part of it. and that's why I love complex music, because it bears repeat listening. There's almost
Mm.
something new to find all the time. So that's my digression, but
It's yeah, well, it's really funny. I mean, like as you say that, I hadn't thought about it for years, but I consumed music in exactly that way as a as a teenager, early 20-year-old, before it started becoming, as you say, like a secondary activity, heading off
yeah.
to work, listening to a record. And the truth is that, like, I'm glad you said this, because I'm almost feeling a bit self-conscious about my own approach to this now too. Like, my experience with music does tend to be, I'll grab Apple Music and just check out the new X album when it comes out, and that tends to be kind of the limit of it. Like, sometimes I'll dig in a little bit deeper when I can. Often I find it's like if I'm chucking like my AirPods or something in, like something that actually lets me have a really nice sort of quiet, nice
Yeah.
listen that isn't just my studio experience. And I'll maybe dig a bit deeper, but gone are the days of having the liner notes, the lyrics, like that
Mm.
full immersive experience. I think I might have to make a similar pledge, because man, I forgot how much I love doing that. It was
Yeah.
a huge part of my musical upbringing.
There's nothing I loved more than seeing certain session musicians popping up in multiple albums here and there. I mean,
Mm.
only in liner notes would I've ever learned the name Pino Palladino,
Yeah, yeah.
or Mel Collins, who I was
Mm.
so thrilled to see pop up again this year in the Fusion Syndicate album. I'm like, oh my God,
Yeah.
Mel Collins is still out there playing sax. And all these bands brought back sax this year.
It
I
does
don't know
feel a
if
bit
that was
like
a
that,
plan.
doesn't
I
it?
don't know if it's what, some convergence or what happened, but I was so happy to hear saxophone popping up
Mm.
in like at least a half dozen songs this year, when I feel like I haven't heard it that many in 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a bigger observation as well, like this idea that we've probably never really had a period of music that that there's so much quality, kind of detailed,
Mm,
interesting, and very artistically driven music, and yet it seems very rare for people to actively listen to music nowadays.
yeah.
So maybe anyone listening to this, good excuse to chuck their headphones on and get the liner notes out. I'm going to be doing it. You've inspired me. I'm into
There you go. Excellent.
it.
So, and before I forget, you guys, of course, have the tour coming up
Hmm.
this time, back in, or gonna back, but getting to the US this time. Gonna try it again,
Yeah,
starting January 31st, if I'm not mistaken, in
that's
DC.
right. Yeah. Man, to say I'm excited about this is such an understatement. I mean, we obviously had the 2020 tour on the back of Rise
Yeah.
Radiant, like basically just fall apart. We sort of pushed hopefully towards it as long as we could, until it just became obvious that it wasn't going to work. We've been to the States twice, just for the Prog Power Festival in Atlanta, which has always just been an unbelievable reception. Like, we know very well from our little metrics and statistics that the US is by far our biggest audience, and we hear from people in the States literally every week about how slack we've been not getting there. I mean, it was pretty hard through the pandemic, but to finally be coming, and to sort of see all of this actually finally followed through after almost 4 years of kind of waiting for the, it seems like, the stars to align, even though that's not the case. It's just been a set of global catastrophes that have sort of
Yeah.
stopped it. I am so excited. Like, I don't think I've ever been more excited in the lead up to a tour.
Cool. Yeah. And you guys picked excellent tour mates in Earthside. So
They're
that's,
great, aren't they? They're so good.
it's gonna be a banger of a show. So I
Totally.
will say, I'm, unless somebody else gets added to the bill somewhere that I don't expect, which could happen, and where I see you guys are coming, but I will say it'll be the first time I can honestly say I went to a show where I've interviewed somebody, a member of every band playing.
Yeah,
I've come
nice. Yeah,
close. I had 2 out of 3 once, but
yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. Like, we're probably not going to be. It's probably just going to be the two of us. I think we're
yeah.
excited by that idea, just in terms of the way the show feels and all of that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. But no, love Earthside. Amazing band. Very, very unique artistic vision.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys are gonna fill that room. That space is not capable of holding both of you.
Awesome.
So it's gonna be great.
Yeah.
So anywhere in particular in the US you're looking forward to going to? Yeah, like any
I mean,
bucket list places you're gonna visit?
like the thing is, because I'm a incorrigible tourist. Like, I love going on tour as much just to check out the cities. And it's worth saying, like, when you have that experience of touring to see places for the first time, you get a wonderful ground level view that you don't often get as like just a pure tourist. But the thing is, I'm not even going to pick any individual place. I mean, there are tons of cities that I am just really excited to finally go to, but I just want to see what the US is like. I've never got to do that, toured Europe so many times, toured other places. Like, I just can't wait to spend 3 weeks getting my head around the USA.
Nice. Yeah. Well, very cool. We'll be very happy to have you. I kind of have that travel bug myself. Someday I hope to be brave enough to go Australia. Everything there can kill you.
Yeah, but
I'm
it
terrified of
usually
tunnel
won't,
web
as long as you're
spiders.
careful. Oh, I mean, don't come up our way if you don't like big spiders, though. I
No.
mean, like,
Yeah.
even last night there was one probably the size of my hand on that wall directly behind. I don't know where he is right now. He's probably amongst
God.
those guitar cases back there. And I'll pick something up and get it crawl up me or something. But they're harmless. They don't hurt you. They're just huge. Which is probably no small consolation, I
No.
suppose.
I'll get disemboweled by a koala or something crazy like that. That's what I figure will happen. But no, someday I'm
Perhaps.
getting there. I know it. But I hope you have a blast in the US. See as much as you can. It looks like it's going to
Absolutely.
be a really fun tour. The album sounds great so far, and it's gonna be my deep dive, my first one of 2024.
Awesome.
And I wish you the best. I hope it is massively successful. And think about it, you're touring 2 albums basically on this
Yeah,
one tour. So a lot of
essentially.
people are gonna be able to hear a lot of music live for the first time.
That's the hope. I'll tell you what, it has not been an easy set list to prune as a result. But no, I can't wait. And thank you so much. It means a lot.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. Appreciate it. You have a good rest of your day. I'm gonna go to bed.
Nice. Good night. I'll
Right?
I'll talk to you sometime soon, no doubt. Might see you in the States. Make
I
sure you
hope
say
so.
hi.
Yep, I will absolutely. I'll see you in Philly maybe. See what happens. Take
Awesome.
care.
All right, mate.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
What a fun interview. I love how thoughtful and how deep Sam goes into the work that he does with the band. It's amazing to hear him just break it all down and really give you a lot of great insights into it. Sam, I want to thank you very much for your time and talking to me. It's really great talking with you. I hope we get to do it again in the near future, and I look forward to seeing you guys when you come around my area in February. Should be a wonderful show with both you and Earthside. That's a banger right there. It's a show not to be missed. Those of you out there watching, the album comes out January 26th, Charcoal Grace. The tour begins January 31st in DC, and then all across the U.S. This will be Caligula Horse's first time touring in the U.S., because as you heard, the last time got pretty well scuppered thanks to the wonderful effects of COVID. So looking forward to that. And once again, Sam, thank you very much for your time. Best wishes for the album and for the tour. I imagine they're both going to be really successful here. From what I've heard so far and what I'm seeing in terms of the tour, it's going to be a hot ticket. So good luck to you and the rest of the band members. Thank you all. And hey, if you've been watching all this, thank you very much for joining us. Do me a favor, hit the like and subscribe, follow along, hit the bell so you know when I'm dropping new content. Social media links are in the description, as is the link for The Expanse, my live 365 channel, which is all prog, rock and metal all the time. The classic to the modern, the mellow to the metal. Got it all there. Go check it out. You might enjoy that. And of course, if you want to dig into my backlog of interviews, you can find them either here on YouTube or you can find them wherever you find podcasts under Bleeding Edge Interviews. So thanks once again for joining me. Appreciate everybody and appreciate Sam Vallen of Caligula's Horse for joining me. That's all I've got for now. This is Super Dave signing off.